Okay, today is a good time to make a video because I have a perfect learning situation. We're going to talk about cracks in cob walls. So it's very common to have what I call cracks. These are really more aesthetic in most cases, sort of surface level fissures or cracks. Now I have a big one here to demonstrate and to talk about. So this is a pretty big piece of cob. This wall here, this wall is 18 inches in thickness and it's getting pretty high. It's about 6 feet high of cob and it'll go another 2 feet higher. So what we have here, and I'll get a close-up here at the end of the video, but I have a big, what I would consider a big crack going up the wall. So a lot of people get very alarmed when they see things like this, and most of the time you'll see them all throughout the wall. Like, you know, every couple feet you'll see a crack and then you'll see them dispersed. It's actually kind of rare to see it going all the way up in one single point. And this crack, you'll also see the same mirrored on the back of the wall. What happens is, it's usually either one or two things that causes this. Either your mix ratio is not ideal. Usually means you need to add more sand or aggregate into the mix. If your soil has too much clay content, you'll get a lot more cracks. For example, a long time ago I did a project in Costa Rica and the soil had so much clay in it, it would have so many cracks in the wall as it dried, and you just could not put enough sand into the mix to compensate. So sometimes it's too much clay, but most of the time it's too much water. So if you put too much water into your cob mix, it leads to these cracks. So for example, here on this wall, this crack formed as the wall dried out and the soil shrinks as it dries, and so it leaves a void where all that water content was, and it's just kind of random where it tends to leave the voids. So in this case it left a void here right in the middle of the wall, and so you'll actually see shrinkage where the cob meets up to the brick. You'll see a very consistent shrink away from the brick, very consistently all the way up the wall. I'm sure it had some shrinkage on this end as well, and then the remaining shrink, it happened in the middle of the wall this time. So you can do a shrink test. I have a separate video on that to get an idea of how much your cob is going to shrink before you start building your walls. So all my shrink tests that I did, at least for this project, they had about 2% shrink. And so that's really what I see here. I see about roughly 2, maybe 3% shrinkage rate on this cob, this whole wall here, which is good. You're looking for anywhere between 0 and 5% shrinkage rate for your cob. So I consider this good. This one crack doesn't bother me at all. Cob is supposed to be monolithic, but it's never completely monolithic, except in rare cases, which I'll talk about. But imagine, let's just say this crack goes all the way through the wall. Your wall is still structurally very sound. It's not going to disturb the structural integrity of the cob wall. It still has the exact same load-bearing capacity. There is a slight separation here, but imagine these as two massive blocks sitting right next to each other, completely form-fitted to each other. Imagine two massive adobe blocks like that. You're not going to worry about that. So these two massive blocks of cob are sitting right next to each other, completely fits like a glove together here in the middle where you see that crack. So there's no structural problem here. This crack actually doesn't go all the way through the wall exactly mirrored like this. So there is still connection even on the interior of the wall. Not to mention the straw. The straw is tying it together. Anyway, the main point I want to get across is if you see cracks like this as your cob wall is dry, don't panic, don't get worried that your cob walls have a serious problem. This is very common for cob. Almost all cob you'll see this, and it's hard to prevent this 100%. If you do want to prevent it 100%, I do have a good strategy for that. My last cob building I did, I had 0 cracks, like not a single crack. And the way I did that was I made dry cob, much drier cob. So the less water you put into the cob, the less shrinkage you're going to have as it dries out, because it's not going to have to leave that void where the water was at. So if you want to prevent cracks, make drier cob. So a lot of people make really wet cob because it's easier to hand sculpt and smooth it out, you know, with your hands and all that. But if you want to do drier cob, it's going to be harder to hand sculpt it, but that's where the form system comes in. So the slip form system. I have tons of videos on this system now on YouTube and on my new video course. This system has so many advantages, but one of the biggest advantages is that you can put much drier cob into the form, and you don't need to hand sculpt it. All you do is put it in the form, tamp it a little bit with the tampers, and you're good. So it allows you to make much drier cob, and in the end it's all just as strong as the wet cob, but you're not going to have all these surface level cracks. So yeah, that's the way to do it. And another thing, sometimes the type of aggregate you use can determine the type of cracks you have. This wall I used masonry sand. For some reason, when people mix cob with a finer sand like this masonry sand, people seem to add a little bit extra water. I'm not really sure why. It doesn't really require it, but it's sort of the texture. People end up adding a little bit more water. The last project I did, I used a very fine gravel. They call it chat here in East Tennessee. It's like a fine gravel, and that worked really well for making the drier, stiffer cob. And yeah, people just kind of didn't need to add as much water. People kind of felt like it's kind of a weird intuitive thing, I guess. But anyway, so the type of aggregate you use can also play into this a little bit. Now if you're doing hand sculpted cob, sculpting and doing like sculptural stuff, you're going to want to use a masonry sand, like a finer sand like that, because that'll allow you to make those sculptural elements. If you're using a gravel like I did, it's a lot harder to sculpt with, but it packs in here very well, and you can make a much drier mix that way too. But either aggregate works. I have had this one crack here using this system because I think it's because I used the masonry sand, and a little bit extra water has been added because of that. But overall, both of these projects have gone extremely well with the slip form system. No matter what kind of aggregate you use, even if you put a little too much water in there, still works really well, prevents a lot of the cracks. So again, to wrap this video up, if you see big cracks, don't panic. Most of the time it's fine, and it's not like you have to scrap the project and restart. To prevent cracks, make sure you have enough aggregate or sand in the cob mix, and most importantly, don't add too much water. That's the biggest mistake I've seen with people making cob, is they add too much water into the mix, because it makes it easier to mix it and hand sculpt it. But that extra water leads to more cracks and more shrink. So if you guys have questions, leave them down in the comment section and I'll get to those. And if you want to learn how to build with cob, engineered cob buildings, come to one of my upcoming workshops. I have one upcoming in September and October here. We're actually going to be working on this wall, this project over here. You can also take my video course. I have full instructions on how to do the slip form cob system, how to make the forms, how to set up the forms, all the different variations, all the materials that you need to make these forms, and how to make the cob and put it in there and all that. So I got tons of information on the internet here. Come out to a class. It's going to be beautiful here in the fall especially. And thanks for watching.